What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to the tutorial video on how to paint the Marvel Crisis Protocol gameplay widgets. In this video, I'll show you specifically the recipes and the colors I used for the Marvel widgets, but you can use them to paint any widgets that you so choose. The colors I've used for these widgets are on the screen now, so if you want to pause the video, note those down, we can continue with the tutorial. So to prime the widgets, I'm using Krylon's Ultra Flat Camouflage Black. I find that this is a very thin but durable primer, great for working on plastic models without covering up too much detail. This is particularly important for the movement widgets because they have the points of actuation in the middle. From there, I'll follow up with some Vallejo Surface Primer Gray, diluted with just a drop of Airbrush Flow Improver, and I'm going to be doing a light gray airbrush on all of the areas that are to be painted. You'll want to do a couple of thin coats to avoid any clumping or spidering that can occur with this primer. To start with, I'm going to use some livery green, and on the movement widgets, I'm going to apply a base coat on the top half. The goal is to get a green to blue fade, so I'm looking to get a nice solid green color on the top half and then start to fade it to below. From there, I'll mix in livery green and blue green, and I'll hit up the middle to bottom. The reason I'm not doing a pure green all the way to the bottom is to avoid any sort of color issue that can occur with mixing. From there, I'll go with some pastel green and I'll hit up the bottom of the medium movement widget, which has a sky gradient in the background. From there, I'll mix in a 50-50 mix of blue green and pastel green, and I'll start to fade in the darker portion of the sky. So I'll flip the widget around and do the top-down gradient, which is effectively bottom-up. And I'll also apply this mix to the front portion of the small and large widget. So wherever the character is running, and then where the character is flying, just to add a bit of darker blue to that area. From there, I'll use some AK yellow. And having masked off the movement widgets, I'm going to apply a base coat to all of the distance portions. So the small, the medium, and the large. I'll apply a few thin coats to make sure that I get a nice solid yellow coverage. From there, I'll mix a 50-50 mix of yellow and blood red to get this yellow-orange mix. And I'll apply a orange gradient on the bottom half. I'm doing very light, thin coats to build up the color slowly. I don't want to overpower the yellow too quickly. And then from there, I'll use pure blood red, and I'll target the bottom quarter, again, building up my layers very slowly. I don't overpower the orange or the yellow. For the range 2 widget, I'm going to start with a base coat of livery green. I'll mix in some white, and I'll target the center of the widget where the two curved X's meet. This is where I imagine the energy effect is really concentrating, and so I want to have a soft white blend right in this area. Using the airbrush is just a quick, easy way to do this. And then with pure white, I'm going to start going in and painting the radioactive effect. So in my mind, I sort of imagine dots or bubbles concentrating in greater and larger amounts as you get closer towards the energy source. So at the center of the X, the goal is to have a pure white cluster of dots, and then we're going to fade it out where the dots get thinner and less frequent the further away you get towards the edge of the widget. For the range 3 widget, I'm going to start with a base coat of fluorescent magenta and fuchsia. You'll want to mix quite a large amount of the magenta because it is fairly translucent, and the goal again is to apply a nice even base coat over the entire widget. Taking that base coat, I'm going to mix in a progressive amount of white, kind of playing it by ear, and then I'm going to focus the highlight around this center portion of the radial. This is where I imagine this burst of or flash of energy happening and where I want my highlight to concentrate. I'm also going to use this to highlight the edges of the inset rays on the widget. So just very carefully applying a fade greater at the center of the burst and then fading it out to not entirely missing, but almost missing near the ends of the widget. I'm going to finish off with a few faded dots. The goal here is to have little sparkles or bursts of energy. I'm going to paint them with white afterwards, but I want to do a bit of pre-blending first. From there, I'll take a 50-50 mix of fluorescent magenta and white, and I'll just apply a stronger highlight near the center. And then using white, I'm going to paint in the energy effect. I recommend looking at reference for comic book effects if you're not sure how you want to paint this. For the range 3, I was imagining an almost anime style of an energy burst or an energy flare. So you're going to have concentric rings focused around where the energy burst is happening, and then you're going to have beams of white light bursting out. This fits what's already sculpted on the widget, and we're just sort of carrying that theme or that motif throughout. You can see that I'm just sort of free-forming a variety of crescents and circles in various sizes, shapes, lengths, and then adding in those light bursts or light rays as I go. For the range 4 widget, we're going to start with a 50-50 mix of blue-green and pastel green for the base coat. And then from there, I'm going to take pure pastel green and apply my highlight, concentrating on the 4, and then working my way out towards the edge of the widget. What I imagine for this one is a strong lightning effect, so I want to make sure that I have really bright highlights concentrated at the bottom of the widget, as it will get fairly dark up top. And then using pure white, I'm just going to freeform lightning effects. I wasn't quite sure the size or the thickness I wanted them, so you can see that as I go, I started off really thin, very diluted, just to block in the general path that the lightning will take. And then as I go and as I layer up and build more lightning effects, I end up crisscrossing the different strands or the different lightning forks. I tweak the sizes, I tweak the thicknesses, I add a few more layers to build up the intensity. And the goal here is to try and simulate a depth or a layering of the lightning forks as I go. I think it's important for this particular effect to make sure that I have the white highlighting on the edges of all of the pre-sculpted raised areas. And then, where possible, try and get the forked lightning to twist and overlap. I think with this one in particular, depth is really, really important, both in layering for translucency or transparency, as well as trying to get the different lightning forks to appear like they're twisting around each other. For the range 5 marker, I'm going to start with a base coat of Scarlet Red. This has a hint of orange in there. I was kind of free-forming the specific recipe for the red one because I know that going to white can make it look pink. So the challenge for this one was to get the highlights working without being too pastel. The highlight, I mixed in a bit of sunny skin tone into the Scarlet Red, and I applied a bright gradient near the 5 and then fading it out just like with the range 4 widget. Again, I avoided using white to keep it from getting too pink. I tried to keep the hue in that orange to sort of sunny skin tone or peach color range. To start painting the effects, I'm going to use pure sunny skin tone. And I kind of started it a little bit lightning, but I ended up also incorporating some curved radials or almost like energy flares. If you picture the sun, if you've ever seen photos of, and I don't know what the term is called, but when you have those big bursts of energy flowing up from the surface of the sun, that's sort of what I wanted to capture with this widget as well. So where the actual sculpt of the widget has those curved bursts, I incorporated a little bit more of those fading outwards or extending outwards. And the goal here was just to create a bit of a combination of, I guess, the range 3 and 4 widgets combining a different lightning effect with a bit of that curved ray energy effect that was happening. Again, like with the range 4 widget, I think it was really important for this one to apply a highlight to all of the edges of the sculpted details as well. And then from there, I'll use pure white and I'll apply a stronger highlight near the base of the widget, so around the 5, and then adding a few highlights to the energy effects, more towards the bottom, taking care not to go too overboard. Again, I don't want it to end up looking too pink. And so really, I just wanted this to concentrate in the brightest, hottest parts of the energy. And here's what all the different widgets look like with all of the energy effects painted in. You can see on the 2, I've got a really strong cluster of dots near the X where it almost hits pure white and is just indistinguishable, fading out towards the edge. For the range 3, I've got a lot of energy rays bursting out from the center, and then as it gets further away, it gets more scattered. On the 3, or the 4, sorry, really strong lightning effects, getting to pure white near the base, and then same thing on the 5. To start to nuance the range 2, I'm going to go back in with a heavily diluted mix of livery green. And the goal here is to effectively start glazing with the airbrush, starting with the edges and working the way towards the center. By building up very thin layers, you can start to create a blend and fade out those green and white dots. From there, I'll start mixing in some Inktense green, again, very diluted, and we're going to do very, very thin passes around the edges on the top and the bottom. The goal here is to darken the widget and create a fade without going too heavy-handed. I want to still maintain that sort of neon gamma radiation green that the livery green has. So I want to be very subtle and very soft with this transition. To glaze the range 3, I'm going to start with some fluorescent magenta, and I'm targeting the middle of the widget. I found that in the highlighting, a lot of that magenta tone was lost, both with the airbrush highlighting, because we introduced white, as well as just not using enough fluorescent in the base coat. So I wanted to just impact or increase the punch of that magenta. And then I went back in with Games Workshop's Volupus Pink Contrast, and again, targeting the top of the widget against the bottom. The goal was to then create that darker fade, moving towards the center. I did end up not diluting this enough, so I think when I was applying it, it ended up being a little too heavy-handed, but all I did was I just knocked back the pressure, added a bit more water for my subsequent layers, and I was able to create a softer transition in the midtones. To glaze the range 4, I start with some achromatic blue contrast. This one is pretty subtle. I think looking back, I would have used a bit of a darker blue, but it still worked pretty well. The goal here was to just fade the forks of lightning, in particular on the top half of the widget, to really start to fade out that white and get it to where it's almost pure blue up top. From there, I mix in Imperial Blue. I would probably say 50-50, 70-30 Imperial Blue to Achromatic Blue, and I concentrated this on the very top parts of the widget. I really wanted to have a strong, darker blend because the Achromatic Blue before wasn't dark enough. And then I also targeted the top of each of the individual segments just to add a little bit more depth. I think painting these widgets is a very good exercise in airbrush control and airbrush accuracy. To glaze the range 5, I started with Scale Colors Inktense Red and basically just did a top to bottom fade. I had never actually used this color before, and when I started using it, I found that the red was incredibly intense and incredibly saturated, which I love. I think if I were to do it again, I would probably dilute it a little bit more. I found that as I was targeting the midtones, it was a little stronger than I expected. And the darker tones, I ended up losing a lot of that free-handed energy detailing. And then to finish off, I went with pure Scarlet Red to darken the very, very top of. Again, because the Inktense red had knocked back a lot of the energy effect anyways, I just leaned into it and I went with some darker red to really add a bit of punch and impact. The Inktense red is still kind of orangey in tone, and I wanted to knock it back into a more crimson shadow area. And then finally, with all the color on the widgets applied, we're going to go back in with black, and we're going to paint in all of the inset details. You're going to want to make sure that you dilute your paint and do a lot of thin layers. This way you avoid having your paint streaks and your brush strokes showing through. What you want to do is have very thin layers, build up the layers, and then where possible, cross or change or alternate the direction of your brush stroke. So that when you're building up your layers, you're just slowly getting it to pure black and hiding all of the individual brush strokes. It won't show through in the end. I think it's really important, especially when you get to the larger 4s and 5s, have a lot of that open black space. You really don't want any brush strokes to show through. It'll make it feel kind of subpar and mediocre. You want a nice, clean, flat, rich comic black. This is probably the most tedious part of the project. A lot of the airbrushing in the previous steps was super quick. Probably only took me about like an hour and a half, 2 hours. Doing the black lining on all of the widgets ended up taking probably another 4 or 5, largely because of all the detailing, all the layers I had to put in, and then especially on the movement widgets, carefully painting all the edges of the detail. You want to make sure that you're not getting that black paint into any of the color. If you do, you want to quickly remove it with a damp brush before it dries. Otherwise, it's very difficult to correct because it is just that airbrush layer. And here are the widgets complete. I'm going to apply a varnish with Mr. Hobby's Super Clear. This is a matte varnish. I found it's very, very good at protecting from handling. And then before I assemble the widgets, I want to actually lubricate the joins. For this, I'll be using a bit of vegetable oil. I'll apply it to the center portions inside and top with a Q-tip, and then I will clip the two widgets together. I find that the vegetable oil is non-reactive with the paint, and it'll apply a thin layer of lubricant to prevent any sort of scratching or sort of wear and tear, because you're going to be twisting and rotating these widgets so often. And that's our completed widgets. Pretty simple and straightforward technique. Use the airbrush, establish a gradient or a blend as our base colors. Go back in with a white or an off-white to paint in our special effects, and then go back in with extra glazes to nuance the effects, and then some darker mid and shadow tones to add a bit more shading and depth to the widgets. The important part is just picking strong, vibrant colors, and then making sure that you're going back in and being very neat with the black lining. Make sure you dilute and thin your paints out to get a nice, smooth black coat of paint. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll have links in the video description below. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.